It seems like, to me at least, the older that I get, the less inclined I am to do things that are risky. When I was much younger, I was big into taking risks. I would jump off of whatever was in front of me. I'd ride every roller coaster I could. I'd just do all sorts of risky things. I would eat food that I had no business eating. Well, okay, I guess that part hasn't changed. But I love to do things in my teens and early 20s that now in my 30s just seem like poor decision making. Now, the idea of jumping off of anything that's higher than my bed and my knees start hurting beforehand. I recently discovered that I am no longer able to ride many of the roller coasters that are available to me. We took the kids to Holiday World while we were on vacation, and I rode one roller coaster with the kids, just one, because as soon as we hit that first bump, my knee rammed itself right into the back of the cart in front of me, and I walked with a limp for the rest of the day and didn't ride any more roller coasters. I did a lot of the water slides, though. That part was cool. But when I was younger, these sorts of things never seemed like anything of a risk to me at all. I just kind of had that, invulnerability of youth, that part that made me believe that no matter what I did, everything was going to turn out okay, or no matter what it was that I ate, I'd be fine, that everything was going to turn out just fine for me in my life. That's why somewhere on the ether of the interweb, there's a video of a much younger Brandon rolling his way down a 70-foot tall sand dune in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's a long story, but as soon as I saw it, I was like, I got to roll off that thing. And a friend said, well, I'm going to record it. But I've never been much of a risk taker when it comes to my money. I don't know if I can say that, actually. I did give Mandy her own credit card. It's true. I don't like to take risks with things that have long-lasting consequences for me and my family. I don't place bets. I don't do a lot of stock buying. I'm not a mover and shaker on Wall Street. That's just not who I am, because I want to make sure that I can use my money to take care of my family and provide and buy power tools and comic books. I've only ever bought one Powerball ticket my entire life, and that was when it was like at $1.4 billion, and even then I would only risk like $5 because I thought, if I can't get it with $5, it's just not worth having, even though it's enough to buy a professional team. Maybe I should have rethought that. Anyway, I don't like to take risks when it comes to finances because I want to make sure that, again, my family's provided for and our needs are met. I think many of us in this room, we would probably say that we don't like to take risks. None of us are really big on risk taking. I mean, sure, there's a certain bit of a rush whenever you do take those kinds of risks, whenever you kind of lay it on the line a little bit. You get that kind of excited feeling as you think about what could be. But as you really start to think about it, some of us have been burned or hurt because we've taken a risk. And because of that, as we get older, it seems like we're less inclined to take risks. We hear stories of people who bet the farm on one thing and that it ends up being a huge windfall for them and everything goes great for their entire families. But we hear far too many stories of people who risk it all and lose it all. And so because of that, we're just not inclined to take many risks in our lives, to do things that might be considered risky or that might hurt our families in any way, shape, or form. If everything works out great, it was a great decision. But how often in life does everything work out the way you hope it will? I can't speak for you, but I know for myself, not that often. We don't want to risk money, health, future, family, or the things that matter to us because they're far too important. And yet, if you stop to think about it, we take risks all the time. None of us consider ourselves to be risk takers, but we do things that are risky every single day of our lives. You take a risk when you set your alarm clock, hoping that it's going to work, hoping that you set the time right, hoping that whenever it goes off, it's going to be just loud enough to wake you up and not just incorporate itself into your dream, because that's always a messed up feeling, right? The song or whatever it is that's playing is just part of the background noise and it doesn't make any sense to you. You take a risk whenever you go and put your key in the ignition of your car in the morning and you turn it, believing that car is going to start the engine and that it's not going to, blow up or, worse, not do anything. We take a risk whenever we put that car into drive, and we merge onto traffic. We're taking a risk believing that we're going to be cautious and alert enough to be able to navigate successfully, and also we're placing trust in other people around us that they're going to be as cautious as we are. We take risks all the time. If you're in this room, you took a risk in getting here. You're going to take a risk when you leave here. If you're watching online, you're taking a risk that your computer is going to work perfectly, or that your internet connection is going to be stable, or that your thing isn't going to melt itself because you didn't check your computer vents. All of these things are risks, and yet we don't consider these actions to be very risky, do we? All the things that I just listed off, you've never really considered them to be much of a risk. You've set your alarm clock last night without a second thought. You put your key in the ignition and turned it without a moment's hesitation. You merged onto traffic, made your way here without a single care in the world. And tomorrow, you're probably going to do the same thing. And yet, each and every one of these things are still a risk. We may not consider them to be a risk, but they are. Every day we put our lives into our own hands. We take a risk, believing that we're somehow going to make it to tomorrow. Why is it that we don't consider these things to be risky? Why is it that we no longer consider these things to be a danger to ourselves? We don't give them a second thought, and yet we overanalyze so many other things. We fill our hearts with worry over things that we genuinely do consider to be risky. The reason why we don't consider those actions of setting your alarm clock or turning your ignition or getting onto the freeway as a risk is because we've learned to trust them. We've learned that these things, that we can trust in them. We now consider them to be so low risk that we do them without thinking about it anymore. We've done them dozens, hundreds, even thousands of times before, and so we trust that when we go to do it again, it's going to be just fine. We have no guarantee of that. We have no stamped seal or any sort of documentation that proves that when we do those sorts of things, it's not going to be a risk for us. And yet, we still continue to do them constantly. We trust in that these things are going to be successful. It's been successful for all those times to come, so we assume that it's going to be successful every time afterwards. When we trust in something, when something has gained our trust, we no longer consider it to be a risk. And trust, as you well know, has been the underlying theme behind everything that we've been talking about in the book of Daniel. As we've looked at this life of this amazing man, we've seen the trust that comes in his relationship with God over and over and over again. We saw it when he was a kid, when he was a teenager being recruited into the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar wanted to feed these kids his food and his wine. And instead he said, I'll just take water and vegetables, please, trusting that God was going to work in the midst of that. And that trust was proved. Because not only was he one of the best in the entire class of people, he was better and wiser than most of the advisors that Nebuchadnezzar had in place for him already. We saw that trust again come up when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that he didn't understand. And for some reason, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to share that dream with anyone, but instead expected them to be able to tell him what the dream was and what it meant. And Daniel went to God and he pleaded with him to give him this vision and this idea of what this dream was. And Daniel was the only one of all of the other wise men and all of the other Chaldeans and other people to be able to tell him what the dream was and what it meant, that proved that all these nations that were ahead and all these nations that would come afterwards would all crumble and fall, but only the nation of God would stand forever. That this kingdom would be an everlasting one. We saw it again with Daniel's friends as they trusted God in their even if moment. When their lives were at risk and they still believed that God's plan and his purpose was better for them than anything else that they could come up with. We saw it when Nebuchadnezzar again had a dream. And Daniel informed him that his pride was going to lead to his downfall. And that if he didn't trust that God was the one in charge of all of this, things weren't going to go well for him. We saw it again a couple of weeks ago with Belshazzar, as his own pride and his own ego led him to spit into the face of God himself. And Daniel told him that this is not going to work out, that God is constant and that we can trust in that. All of these stories throughout the life of Daniel that lead to this notion of Daniel trusting in God. At today's narrative, the story that we're going to look at today, that trust is about to be tested on a whole new level. Because when Daniel faces today, this is one of the few narratives in the book of Daniel where Daniel is actually front and center. And he's about to face something so incredibly dangerous, a situation that he's never faced before. And his trust is about to be tested. Not only is his trust going to be tested because Babylon is a whole different world than it was last time. If you recall, we mentioned how after Nebuchadnezzar's death, there was kind of a power struggle in the nation of Babylon, that there were all kinds of different people striving to get to the throne, and that when it all shook out, Belshazzar was running the entire country in the place of his father, Nabonidus. I practiced that in front of the mirror because I struggled with it so many times. Babylon was facing a famine and an economic downturn, and Belshazzar decided, let's throw a party. Weird time to do that. God saw Belshazzar's pride and disrespect of the elements made to worship him. He decided to not only rip away Belshazzar's life, but also the kingdom of Babylon itself. The Persians and the Medes were beginning what would become their campaign to become the new world leaders, to take over where Babylon had been before, to become the global superpower. And it started that night, the night of that fateful party, whenever Belshazzar was killed. A man by the name of Darius the Mede was placed as the ruler of Babylon and in that area. Darius seemed to have a good mind for this particular appointment. Maybe he was a little more experienced. He was about 60 years old whenever he took over. He felt that the best way for him to keep the peace, to kind of keep the citizens in line, was to distribute his power. This led to him establishing about 120 satraps. A satrap is essentially just a representative of the king himself. People who would kind of govern small areas of Babylon in order to keep things in line, but be representative of the king. Those 120 satraps would report to 3 different administrators. One of those administrators is somebody that we've become rather familiar with, a man by the name of Daniel. The implication here is that Darius had placed people who were part of the old regime as a way to kind of make things a little easier in this transition period. For the people to have faces that they were familiar with, still in positions of power, to still hold on to some normalcy. Make changes, but don't change too much. It's a nice, comfortable balance for him. But Daniel was absolutely amazing in his role. Right? I mean, we kind of knew that because we've seen him be amazing literally the entire other book. He's been amazing at every step of the way, so it shouldn't be any surprise that Daniel is so amazing that verse 3 tells us what he's going to do in Daniel chapter 6. It says, Daniel distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Daniel is so good at his job. He is such a great administrator, handling all his business so efficiently and effectively that Darius is ready to fire 122 people and just put Daniel in charge of it all. I want to point out, at this point in time, Daniel's about 80 years old. That's pretty old. And yet he's so good at what he's doing that Darius wants to put this 80-year-old man in a position to do the jobs that 122 other people were doing. That is one impressive dude. I mean, I don't know about you, when I'm 80, I don't want to be doing the job of 122 people. I want to be sitting on a lake somewhere, throwing a fishing line in, even though my wife won't eat the fish. That's just what I want. Not doing this, but Daniel is so impressive that this is what's happening. It says that he was so incredible at this job that he was going to be placed over the whole realm. But there's a problem. See, there's 122 guys who really don't like this idea. Like anyone who's had any sort of political or power of any kind, they don't want to lose that. So they do what a lot of politicians before them and a lot of politicians afterwards do. They went looking for dirt. They went looking for skeletons in Daniel's closet. But there's a problem. And verse 4 tells us what that problem is. The administrators and satraps therefore kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy. No negligence or corruption was found in him. This is maybe the only time that a person has spent their entire adult life holding public office and has no corruption to be found. What a wonderful concept that might be. Daniel is a politician with no skeletons in the closet. Can we just vote him in? Is that okay? That's the kind of guy that Daniel is. He's so consistent that there's no corruption to be found within him. And they come to the decision that the only way that they could ever possibly get Daniel out of here is if there's some sort of a conflict between the law of the land and the law of Daniel's God. And here's the thing about laws. If there's not a law already, maybe we can just make one up. And that's what they do. And let's be real. The best way, at least so far that we've seen throughout the life of Daniel, the best way to make a law that goes against the law of God, to get the king to establish something that goes against what Daniel would want, the best way to do that is to play off of Darius's ego. And so these advisors and these satraps, they come before Darius and they tell him, hey, here's the thing, king, we think you're amazing. You're so awesome. You're the best. In fact, you know what? We think you're so good that you ought to sign an ordinance. And this ordinance would say that for the next 30 days, for the next month, no one should pray to any god or any man except for you. Because you're so great. Because you're so awesome. You can handle all of that. And in fact, you know what, Darius? We think that nobody should pray to you so much so that if they're found to be praying to any other god or any other man, they shouldn't just be killed. They should be placed into the lion's den, where they can be ripped apart, limb from limb, so that their last moments on earth are nothing but pain and agony. Real fun guys. And it works. Darius ends up signing this sort of thing into law. He becomes this kind of person. I don't know what it is about the nation of Babylon that all of its leaders are so full of themselves. They're so prideful that, of course, this situation works. Darius signs this ordinance, and for the next 30 days, no one can pray to anyone but him. How do you enforce that law? Like, do guards just go around to people's houses and watch them pray? See, Daniel's reached a crossroads moment in his life. This is the first time that Daniel's really experienced the law of the land being at odds with the law of the God that he has learned to trust his entire life. And when Daniel faces this crossroads, when he faces this difficult moment in his life, he does what he always does. Verse 10 tells us exactly what it was. It says, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room were open towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God just as he had done before. How does Daniel respond when the law of the land and the law of God are at conflict with each other? He prays about it. And I love that last part of that verse where it says, just as he had done before. This is not the first time that Daniel's ever prayed or petitioned towards God. He does this 3 times a day. He has that discipline within himself that 3 different times throughout the day, no matter what is going on, he is going to take a time to pray. to give thanks to God, to glorify Him, to seek Him out in the midst of this. That is a man who is consistent in his faith, a man who is constant in his striving to become more what God has called him to be. God has earned his trust. He's seen that trust that he's placed in God proved over and over and over again. And so now, when the law of the land is at conflict with the law of God, Daniel's still going to turn towards God. Because God has earned that trust in his life. That's who he is. And unfortunately, the satraps and the administrators, they knew that about Daniel. They knew that no matter what, Daniel was still going to pray to his God. And in verse 11, they find their proof. It says, "Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. They caught him red-handed." And now, like kids on a playground, they're telling. They run so fast to Darius. Darius, didn't you just sign a document that says nobody can pray to anybody but you? Darius has got to be a little confused in that moment. Like, yeah, you guys were there. You saw me sign it. Like, what's the deal here? Well, Daniel was praying to his God and not to you, so you got to put him in the lion's den, don't you? And Darius doesn't respond in a way that I would probably expect for this, let's go ahead and use the word egotistical king. See, we might expect him to get upset, we might expect him to get angry, we might expect him to just become completely disgusted by Daniel, refusing to bow to this edict, refusing to pray to him instead of his own God. But that's not how Darius responds. We see his response in verse 14. It says, "As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased, and he set his mind on rescuing Daniel, made every effort until sundown to deliver him." Now, you and I, we don't live in a monarchy, so we might look at this particular idea that Darius is upset that Daniel is going to have to die, and it kind of makes sense. Again, we talked about that Darius wanted to make Daniel in charge of the whole thing. He had that much faith in him. So now when Daniel has done this sort of thing, he's got to put him to death, right? Well, you're the king. Can't you just say, like, just write a couple of words on the side, "Except Daniel"? Can't you change the law? Can't you do something like that? You're the king, right? Well, verse 15 kind of gives us an idea of what the situation is. It says, "Then these men went together to the king and said to him, 'You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed.'" It was a function of the entire nation of the Persians and Medes that if a king or a governor or somebody in authority placed an edict or a law of some kind, well, you can't change that. Not even the king himself can make a change to it. See, in our culture and context, this is kind of similar to the Constitution. See, we can't change the Constitution. That's part of our setup and our system of government, that you and I cannot make changes to the Constitution. We can add amendments to it. That's where we get things like prohibition, and then later on the repeal of prohibition. Those are amendments to our Constitution. They're not changes being made. And the way the Persians and the Medes set up their system of government as they became this global superpower was they said no matter what the king says, whatever law or ordinance he puts in place, you can't change it, even if you're the king. So Darius is in this awkward situation. He's put this ordinance in place that now seems so stupid and so foolish. And it's about to cost him not just a great worker, not just a trusted worker, but his best worker. The guy so good that he felt like he could do the job of 122 others. He tried to save him. He did everything that he could, but he couldn't do it. Daniel is arrested. and they lower him into the lion's den. And Darius says something interesting to Daniel. We see it at the end of verse 16. As Daniel's being lowered in, he says, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." I want to take a moment. I want to try to put ourselves into Daniel's shoes for a minute. The last couple of days have been really weird, right? Daniel has spent his life in service to these men of authority. He's seen it all. He's done it all. And for the first time ever, at 80 years old, a king has come that put a law in place that is directly contradictory to how Daniel believes and to his faith. He's trusted God his whole life. He has put everything into him. The reason why Daniel is in the position that he's in is only because of God. His trust has been proved over and over and over again, but now it's illegal for him to continue to seek and pursue that God. And when Daniel does what just comes naturally to him at this point in time, when he goes and he talks to God about this whole situation and he pleads with him about it, he gets arrested. It's one thing to tell other people to trust in God. It's one thing to show other people why they should follow after him and why they should place their trust in him. It's a whole different thing when you're being lowered into the lion's den. I got a feeling that no matter how strong his trust in God was, there's got to be that moment as he's looking down and seeing these hungry, gigantic cats, where maybe, just maybe, he's not so certain about his trust. Darius doesn't like any of this. He does his duty. He puts Daniel in the lion's den. He seals it with his own seal for the whole night. Can't go anywhere near it. But he can't sleep. He can't eat. There's nothing that his entire kingdom has for him to be able to distract him, to take his mind off the situation for just a few moments, to get some rest. And the minute he sees daylight, the minute he sees it rising over the horizon, Darius takes off like a shot, goes straight to that lion's den, and he yells out, asking Daniel, "Did your God save you? Did this God that you continually serve, did he rescue you from the lion's den?" And then there's a pause for dramatic effect. And then verses 21 and 22. Then Daniel spoke with the king, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. They haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. Also before you, your majesty, I have done no harm." Daniel survived. He survived the lion's den. He'd been faithful to God. He had placed his trust in him, even when it didn't make sense, even when it seemed like everything was collapsing around him, even as he's being lowered into the lion's den, Daniel still trusted. Just as he always had. After Darius had, let's say, taken care of these other satraps and administrators, seriously, go back and read verse 24. It's pretty hardcore. Those lions were hungry, so it's only an act of God that Daniel survived. He issues another decree. We see that decree in verses 26 and 27, and it's pretty significant. It reads, "I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Daniel had trusted in God, even in the midst of this incredibly intense situation of his life, even when his life was at the darkest moment. And when God came through for him, it didn't just have an effect on Daniel. It led Darius into worship of God. Daniel's bold trust of God had a profound effect on those around him. You got to imagine that even with the history, right? Even with Daniel's history with God, while he's being lowered into the lion's den, that has to be a difficult moment for him. It had to be difficult even before that, when the ordinance was first written and Daniel's prayers were illegal. Yet, we can't miss this part, Daniel continued to trust in God, even in the midst of this law and even in the midst of the lions themselves. Daniel still trusted God. You and I face some very difficult moments in our lives, do we not? One of the things that we can count on in our life is that we're going to face hard times. We're going to face times where it feels like everything around us is collapsing, where it feels like nothing is going right, where it feels like it's at its end. We face our own lion's dens. And it's in those times where trusting in God is so difficult for us. No matter how old you are, no matter how long you've been a part of the faith, no matter how long you've known God and been known by God, still, when we face those difficult moments, that trust does not come easy to us. And yet, if there's one thing in the life of Daniel, if there's one thing through this whole experience that we can take away, if there's one thing that we can take away from all of Scripture, it's that God is worthy of our trust. I know. That's something that's so easy for somebody like me to say, right? Especially when we're in this context and in this setting, it has just that right amount of spirituality to it. But I don't know your lion's den. I don't know what situation you're facing. I don't know how difficult it's getting for you. And I know for myself that when I face those moments, trust does not come easy for me. It's difficult to do that. But here's something I do know. God has been worthy of your trust throughout your life. He's done it in small things. He's done it in big things. He allowed you to wake up this morning. He gave you the means to see to your needs to this point. He's been there for you through thick and thin. God has always been there. I doubt this too. I doubt it when I hit those big things. But that's when I need to pause and remind myself that God has been reliable, that his trust has been proved over and over again. And I'm guessing that he's been just as reliable for you too. It may not always feel like it in the moment, and things may not work out the way that we want them to, or the ways that I think they ought to. But I know that sometimes once I get some distance between the moment and now, as I look back, things probably worked out the way they should have. And oftentimes, things ended up being better than what I wanted. More than that, our trust of God when it seems to be riskiest, if we can continue to have that bold trust of God, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it feels like everything is falling apart, it's not just going to have an effect on us. It's going to have an effect on those around us. Those who know the situation, those who know what's going on, they still see us somehow trusting God even in the midst of our own lion's den. And it's still going to have a profound effect on them. Darius saw the trust that Daniel had in his own God. And that trust led Darius himself into worship of God. Sometimes, a lot of times, our best testimony, our best proof of God's will in our own lives is when we choose to trust Him in the midst of times when it feels risky. When we still continue to have faith and trust that God is going to be in the midst of this, no matter how dark the situation, no matter how crazy and desperate we feel. If we continue to trust in God, it won't just affect us, it'll affect those around us. Trust is a difficult thing for us to wrap our minds and our hearts around. No matter how much we've talked about it, no matter how much we've seen it through the life of Daniel, trust never comes easy for any one of us. I would say including and maybe even especially when it comes to trusting God at times. But I want to challenge you with something this week. I challenge you guys pretty frequently. We know that. And I'll be honest, there's a part of me that always wonders, is anybody actually doing this? But this one I want you to take seriously because I think this is going to help you not just today, it's going to help you long term. Sometime whenever you're home, later today, sometime this week, Tuesday at 4:37 p.m. Pick a time, I don't care. Sit down, grab a piece of paper, and make a list. And this list needs to be all the times in your life that you can recall that God has been worthy of your trust. When God has come through for you. They can be big things, huge things. We were able to pay that bill on time even though we didn't have much money. Or that somebody spoke the right encouragement at the right time to me when I felt the most desperate. Or that God showed His love through this person's actions. It can be small things. We had just enough food to cover dinner last night. We had just enough gas in our car to get to work and back. Big ways, small ways. And then look at that list. Keep that list. And the next time you face a lion's den moment, and the next time you face those moments where trusting God feels risky, and it feels hard, and it feels difficult, go back to that list. Remind yourself of how many times God has been worthy of your trust. And then I think that trust in the midst of the lion's den might come a little bit easier this time. Because if He's come through me here, I know and I can trust that He'll come through for me here. God has been worthy of our trust in big ways and in small ways. No matter what the situation is, I don't know what your situation is, but I know that God is going to work in the midst of that. You can trust in that.